audience into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator. And tonight, we're very proud to be hosting the launch for Wagnerism by Alex Ross. He'll be in conversation with A.O. Scott. You can buy copies of the book on powerhousebookstores.com. They all come with a signed book plate while supplies last. And I will post a link here, and they will also be in the event page. To say, I just finished the book, and it's a stunning work of research and criticism. I'm hearing Wagner everywhere I go now. And everybody should buy this book. You really won't regret it. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Alex will take your questions at the end of the event. Before we begin, Scott Carlton here from the Wagner Society of New York will say a few words. So,
thank you, Chris. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott Carlton. I'm the Director of Singer Programs of the Wagner Society of New York. And on behalf of the Society and its president, Natalie Wagner, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the United States launch of Alex Ross' book, Wagnerism. I'd like to say a few brief words about our organization. We're a nonprofit chartered for the purpose of furthering the appreciation and performance of the works of Wagner. And one very important function we serve is the promotion of young Wagnerian talent. We seek out young voices, promote them with financial aid, travel grants, study grants, and we seek performance opportunities for them, which, as you can imagine, in this environment is particularly difficult. I want to read an excerpt from the review of Wagnerism by author Simon Williams. This review will appear shortly in our monthly publication, Wagner Notes, and I quote, "This is a noteworthy book with breathtaking range and scope by an author who is as good a literary critic as he is a musicologist. Ross does not lard his prose with jargon or, for that matter, with Wagnerian grandeur. He writes first and foremost because he loves to tell stories, and there can be no grander reason for writing than that. Above all else, this book is a true pleasure to read." End quote. I can absolutely second the motion about the book being an enormous pleasure to read. I finished it last night. Seeking an adjective for it was difficult. I discarded encyclopedic as being somewhat referential and a list, and I came upon organic because the book really is an organic drawing together of the many, many elements of Wagner's world, the influence he had and continues to have on the arts, philosophy, literature, politics, history, cinema, theater, and music. I'd like to mention in particular the chapter Nebula. It's a masterful survey of Wagner and anti-Semitism, and it's as complex and non-polemic a summation as I personally have ever encountered. Very briefly, I'd like to say there's a certain danger in reading this book, as there was with Alex's previous book, The Rest is Noise. And that danger is that you're going to find yourself with a lifetime reading list. The source material is both vast and utterly engrossing. Finally, lodged like Rheingold throughout the book are vignettes and anecdotes, which are a true pleasure. Among my favorites is an element contained in an anti-Wagner diatribe written in 1892 by a certain Max Nordau, who charges Wagner with, among other defects, megalomania, erotomania, graphomania, and a tendency to stupid puns. With that, let's turn now to a discussion between the author and A.O. Scott, music critic of the New York Times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Let me quickly introduce our speakers, and we can begin. A.O. Scott is chief film critic at the New York Times and the author of Better Living Through Criticism. Alex Ross has been the music critic for The New Yorker since 1996. His first book, the international bestseller, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won a National Book Critics Circle Award. His second book, the essay collection Listen to This, received an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. He was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2008 and a Guggenheim Fellow in 2015. Hand it over now. Thank you.
Thanks. It's good to see you, Alex. I'm sorry we can't see each other in person, which is always a pleasure and is long overdue. I was thinking of a word like Scott to try to describe Wagnerism, and I ended up having to make one up because it's such an extraordinary and unusual accomplishment. One of the Wagnerian words that recurs throughout the book, a very contested term in the Wagnerist lexicon, is Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea of a total or synthetic work of art, drawing on all of the other arts to make something new and powerful and as Scott said, organic. And I think of your book, Wagnerism, as kind of a if you'll forgive me, Gesamtkritikwerk, a sort of a work of synthetic or total criticism, because you draw on biography, intellectual history, aesthetic theory, political theory, the analysis of, in addition to, of course, music, film, literature, painting, architecture, and you really touch on just about every aspect of not only of modern music and culture and politics, but really of modern life of the last 150 years. So it's kind of daunting to know where to begin. And I guess where I'd like to begin is sort of to ask you where you began, to ask you to talk a little bit about the genesis and evolution of this project and how it came to achieve the shape that it has.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, and it's wonderful to see you as well. And thank you so much for your kind words and those of Scott as well. And it's wonderful to hear that the book is something of a pleasure to read, because it wasn't always a pleasure to write. And there were times when I felt sort of my own eyes rolling back in my head at the sort of enormous accumulation of materials. But I worked very hard with my brilliant editor, Eric Chinsky, who I believe is out there somewhere, to get this agglomeration under control and attempt to extract some kind of readable document from it. But yeah, the book arose from a long-standing fascination, not just with Wagner himself, but I think that really at the core of the idea is to talk about the arts talking to one another. And I think, how ideas from one art form bleed into another is a fascinating topic that's difficult to analyze because each art form has its own preferred mode of understanding itself, and it all sort of breaks down when you move into the neighboring art form, and so to find the language to observe this kind of sort of assembly of all the art forms together was a challenge. But I mean, that's how I grew up. I think I was just interested in all the different arts, and then eventually I gravitated toward music, but I was passionately interested in other fields as well. And I was always fascinated by this period of the fin de siècle, and the book is really ultimately about the arts at the fin de siècle, end of 19th century, early 20th century, which for me, when I was growing up, just seemed like this paradise when art was all that anyone cared about in a way. And the streets of Vienna were full of composers and poets, and there were celebrities and so on. Of course, I gradually realized that there were sort of shadows in that paradise and dark forces at work. But that sort of that kind of mesmerizing effect that that period has always had on me was also kind of the reason really to write this book in the end, because just Wagner was for me such a fascinating thread to follow through that period, starting earlier and of course ending more or less today, going all the way through the 20th century into the 21st. And then in terms of Wagner himself, and this was kind of a slow process of my coming to terms with the music. I had a distinct aversion to it at first when I heard it as a kid. It sounded amorphous and endless and indistinct and vaguely kind of sickening. And then in college, I was sort of very much looking at Wagner as an intellectual problem, a political problem, anti-Semitism and everything else. And then only sort of in my 20s and my 30s did I really begin to understand, I think, Wagner as a theater artist, and that's ultimately what he was. And I think he had such an extraordinary effect because he was a theater artist who wrote the music, he wrote the text, he directed the productions, he even more or less designed the theater in which they took place toward the end of his life at Bayreuth. And so his imprint is on every aspect of these works, and so many artists and figures from other fields found something of great interest there. And it's sort of a continuation, I think, of what I was doing in my first book, The Rest is Noise, in terms of studying how music intersects with the rest of culture and society and politics. And Wagner is just sort of the ultimate case study in art becoming swept up in sort of the entire world around it, and being just, there's no way you can ever confine him to some pure, separate artistic sphere. So I think it was just, for all kinds of reasons, I was just more or less fated to write this book at some point. And of course, it took me quite a long time to get through to the end of it.
Well, at the very end of the book, you characterize your own engagement with Wagner as I think that working from a script of passionate ambivalence, and the account that you give of your own sort of aversion and then fascination and appreciation of Wagner's music is mirrored in very interesting ways by a lot of the figures that kind of come into Wagner's orbit during his lifetime and then also posthumously. And I really, one of the things that I just appreciated so much about this book as a work of criticism is how the sense of the power of ambivalence, that is to say, it's not, ambivalence is not as Freud and others remind us, isn't a neutral state of indifference or objectivity or kind of moderation, but a sort of a passionate push and pull in other directions. And so many of the figures, starting maybe with the first great Wagnerian, Nietzsche, have in your book kind of repeat this drama of aversion and worship, and from Mark Twain to Adorno, and how do you account for that kind of the intensity of the response? Because in a way, what Wagnerism turns out to be, I think, as you trace its history and its different manifestations, is not just admiration for or being influenced by Wagner, but also being repulsed or horrified or confused by it.
Yeah. Well, that's a pattern, certainly right from the beginning. And so many of these figures are extremely conflicted in their attachment to Wagner. And that's what I realized about my own engagement with him and coming to terms with him. I mean, it felt very personal and very distinct to me, but it turned out on examination, I was following a very old pattern. And yeah, it begins with Nietzsche, and really even earlier with some early French figures and Baudelaire. And there aren't that many just kind of unambiguous, sort of doubt-free Wagner worshippers in this book. There are some, they tend to be a bit out of their minds and kind of contradict their own sort of worship, just with the sort of strangeness of the rhetoric that they use, thinking particularly of Villiers de l'Isle Adam, who said that Wagner was a genius such as comes upon the earth once every 1,000 years. So you get this kind of somewhat self-defeating rhetoric. But yeah, the most common pattern is some mixture of, it's not as simple as sort of love and hate. You know, it's this kind of fascination mixed with skepticism. It is sometimes an initial sort of fanatical, youthful enthusiasm, which gives way to a more mature, greatly reduced, but still kind of intense, interest in the subject. And that goes for Nietzsche, obviously. It goes for James Joyce. It goes for even Virginia Woolf to some extent. And why that happens with so many figures is an interesting question, because I mean the issues at stake are different. Of course, since Nazi Germany, and actually long before Nazi Germany, Wagner's anti-Semitism is a cause of this ambivalence for many people, as it certainly was for me once I first learned of it. But there are others for which that wasn't so much the issue as deep problems with his sort of theoretical thinking. Sometimes they loved the music, but they hated the ideas. Some people actually loved his ideas of the Gesamtkunstwerk and others, but didn't actually appreciate the music. George Eliot actually fell into that category. And so just very few people could really sort of take the whole Wagner and kind of accept every aspect of it. And there was just an element to him which was just deeply divisive, from the moment he first appeared on the scene. And I think he imposed himself so strongly as a personality that there's just sort of a need to sort of hold him at arm's length, even when one is sort of falling very much under the spell of the music. But yeah, it comes in all different forms. It's this ambivalence. But I think there's actually something healthy about having that degree of skepticism toward any figure in the arts. I think. I mean, it's just sort of straightforward worship, I think, is somewhat to be avoided. I think it sort of has hazards built into it in terms of our tendency to idealize art to a kind of extreme degree. And what I say at the end is idealization of Wagner is simply no longer possible. And that is something of a healthy outcome.
Well, and I mean, there's a quote from Nietzsche very early on where he says something like, I'm going to paraphrase it, to reject Wagner's art is as unjust as to wholeheartedly embrace it.
Right.
And that seems in some ways to set the tone. And it's interesting because one of the sort of issues in criticism very recently has been, and not only in criticism, in contemporary culture, is how to deal with the so-called problematic figures. How do you deal with artists who, in their personal behavior, their political beliefs, or their allegiances, or even in some aspects of their art itself, give some kind of offense or pose a kind of an unacceptable challenge to the values we like to think of ourselves in a liberal society as holding. And in a way, Wagner is the great exemplar and almost sort of the limit case of that. I mean, he's identified so strongly. I mean, I think if people know nothing else about him, still probably the association with anti-Semitism and with Nazi Germany. You have a great account of how Hollywood movies sort of created this and promulgated this cliche of the Wagner-loving Nazi. As sort of, you hear certain passages from Wagner's music, and it would indicate, that you're in the presence of of evil. But you also show how, even though those implications are based in the real record of his own life and of some of his heirs and followers, that his legacy also isn't just kind of confined to that complicity.
Yeah. No, he is sort of more or less the godfather of cancel culture. People have been trying to cancel him, or have been sort of asking whether the man is just too horrible to listen to his music, since 1855 or so. So it was sort of a constant discussion during his own lifetime, and it's become ever more intense since then. And yeah, I mean, I'm trying to seek a balance here. I don't want to idolize him, and I don't want to demonize him either. He was a hugely problematic figure as a personality, as a thinker, really as an artist. I mean, there are aspects to his artworks which are problematic in terms of the extreme demands that they make. But he did have some redeeming qualities. I don't necessarily think he was absolutely one of the worst people who ever lived. And the work simply compels attention. The question of whether we should still be listening to Wagner is somewhat beside the point, because this is a work of cultural history, and I'm sort of describing an event that took place in cultural history, and observing the effect that Wagner had, in the past, and whether this is going to go on is an open question. And I'm not going to get into a big argument with anyone who simply refuses to listen to the music because they find Wagner too repulsive. I respect that, but I do think if you define Wagner completely in terms of his anti-Semitism, in terms of this posthumous relationship with Nazi ideology, and I think it's just good to remind people that Wagner was, in fact, Wagner died 6 years before Hitler was born, so there is a considerable gap of time there. To sort of overemphasize that, and I think for a lot of people, this is just the one thing they know about Wagner, is that he was Hitler's favorite composer. And there was a lot more to him than that. And in terms of his influence, it was far, far wider than that. And it went across the political spectrum from the far left to the far right. And it touched upon so many different areas of society and so many groups within society. And I talk about Jewish Wagnerians, gay Wagnerians, African-American Wagnerians. And so it somehow kind of just discounts all of those experiences and all of those other engagements to say Wagner's ultimate destination, his inevitable ultimate destination, was Nazi Germany, and somehow that is where Wagner was correctly understood. And I think that's an idea to be resisted. The great theater critic Eric Bentley, who just died at the extraordinary age of 103, I think it was, asked all the way back in 1943, is Hitler always right about Wagner? And of course, his implicit answer was no. Hitler should not possess Wagner for all time. So there is an agenda in this book to correct that balance somewhat, sort of fill in the rest of the picture in terms of Wagner's influence, but without ever losing sight, without ever for a moment obscuring that central line of influence, which does go very directly from Wagner to Hitler, not to attempt to cover that up in any way, simply to put it in a greater context. And I think perhaps for some people, having experienced all of these more amusing and innocent-seeming aspects of Wagnerism, to arrive back at Nazi Germany in the 13th chapter, it may be all the more shocking. And it was, I think, more shocking for me. It was just so dismaying to see an artist who had such an extraordinarily wide effect be confined to such a dark place on the ideological spectrum, in great part because of his own beliefs. He participated in this process. It was not this random accident that happened to him.
but at the same time, and I think you do an extraordinary job in the dozen chapters before we arrive at Nazi Germany to really kind of fill in that blank and that context, and to show the very different uses to which Wagner was put, and the different affinities that arose in different countries and among different political and artistic tendencies. This was for me the real adventure of the book, was to discover, that in his own life, Wagner started out, very much on the left during the revolutions of 1848, was sort of a figure of radical liberation in a way, and to see all of the different kind of Wagner. So there's a democratic Wagner and an authoritarian Wagner. There's an avant-garde Wagner. It's amazing to go in the space of a few pages from which is the first place where I guess we'd call it Wagnerism kind of arises as a very avant-garde tendency, as with Baudelaire and Verlaine and Mallarmé, to come to the United States, where the big Wagner fan is John Philip Sousa, and you have sort of a hip Wagner and a square Wagner. You have a high culture Wagner and a pop culture Wagner, and it's I don't know how you account for that variety, but it's extraordinary. I mean, I kind of made a list of all of the different people who are Wagnerists of one kind or another, and I was just thought I could even just throw out a couple names and you could say a few words, because there are people who showed up in this book who I didn't expect to find here. Say, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, as an example, as you say, of a kind of African American Wagnerism, which is not something that I knew about.
Yeah, I mean, this always comes as a surprise to a lot of people. I think, Du Bois had a fascination with German culture, and he studied in Berlin in the 1890s, and so he was sort of vulnerable to the sort of Wagnerian influence, just because of his fascination with all things German. But the work itself appealed to him very strongly as a model for sort of how you take a culture's myth, a people's mythic past, and bring it to life as modern art. And for him, this could be a model for how African Americans would take mythic themes and mythic figures from their own traditions and build great new artworks out of them. And he felt he simply did not see Wagner as an enemy. And in terms of Wagner's racism, he was absolutely unambiguously anti-Semitic. He was one of the worst anti-Semites of his period. In terms of what he thought about Black people, you would expect him to be contemptuous. And there are a couple of stray comments where he does sound bigoted about Black people. But then, especially in Cosima Wagner's diaries, you find him saying much more sympathetic things about African Americans in particular, and the plight of African Americans. And you find him making admiring comments about the Zulu king Cetshwayo, whom he saw a picture of and found a very impressive personage. So, he simply didn't spend a lot of time thinking about Black people. It just was not a matter of deep concern to him. And I think even though Du Bois wouldn't have read the diaries, since they weren't published until the 1970s, he sensed, I think, that this was a figure who was not an enemy, who there was something, he could find something sympathetic in Wagner. And one tiny clue that he and Langston Hughes also picked up on was a very brief mention in one of Wagner's letters of the Black actor Ira Aldridge, who was performing in Zurich. And it looked from this letter as though Wagner wanted to go see Aldridge perform his legendary turn as Othello. And he didn't make any comment about the experience afterward, but it seems likely that he went. And so this was just this kind of, sort of stray sign that, Wagner took an interest in this great Black artist of the 19th century. And one thing I'm quite proud of in this book is that I turned up evidence in archives at Northwestern of Aldrich's daughter, Laurana, and how she was cast as one of the Valkyries at Bayreuth in 1886. And she ended up not performing because she fell ill. But I discovered this letter from Cosima Wagner, Wagner's widow, to Laurana Aldrich, which is just an astonishing document in itself, because we think of Cosima quite rightly as deeply racist herself, but she obviously appreciated the singer, almost welcomed her into the family, because she became quite good friends with the daughter, Wagner daughter, Eva, who even more strangely ended up marrying Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the English turned German racist philosopher who later hailed Hitler as the savior of Germany. So sort of many layers of irony, but this is, you can make too much of this just sort of passing moment, but it does give you a richer picture of how Wagner acted in people's lives, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was approaching a kind of universality, and then it was taken away.
And it's a universality that's also very. I mean, it's interestingly multifarious. It takes so many different forms and manifests itself differently in different countries. I mean, there's a great passage that you have where you kind of lay out the different Wagners in different nations, the way the French Wagner, the Soviet Wagner, the American Wagner. And you go as far afield in this book as Japan and Latin America. And it's interesting that a figure who's so, in a way, defined with a single national culture and a national mythology, who's seen to be kind of the embodiment, at least in some of his stories and his theatrical style and his ideas of Germanness, should become such a kind of a global and a cosmopolitan and adaptable figure.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, because when we think of Wagner as so monolithic and forbidding, and sort of this great German patriarch glowering out at you from all those photographs, which maybe I have a prop around here of well, I do have the Wagner action figure. It doesn't give you a very good idea, but just that face, and sort of he stylized himself as sort of this Renaissance kind of German colossus, especially toward the end of his life. But he was actually much more chameleon-like, just as a personality. He was restless. He had this kind of actorly personality. He was just always kind of running around and doing different voices and impressions, and was sort of just took over any gathering just with this kind of volcanic energy that he had. And I think that's mirrored in terms of the influence, because in a strange way, with all these sort of multiplying Wagners and multiplying Wagnerisms, the man himself sort of starts to recede as the book goes along. Sort of the picture of who he was and what this work means grows rather hazy, which interested me very much. And of course, this is what happens with art. It's just art ends up being refracted through so many different people's lives and experiences that it ends up being, appropriated by sort of different political groups and so many different experiences. Somehow it just seems all the more acute with Wagner, because people had such a sense that he was speaking directly at you, and just sort of the visceralness of the experience, in the sense that you yourself were being heightened and empowered, and so many young people had these visions of future greatness while listening to Wagner. And at the same time, the content is so vague, or the content is so mutable, and just sort of Wagner just turns into this mirror, intensifying mirror of whoever is under his spell. And so that's, again, I think that happens just routinely with how artwork moves out into the world, but there's something especially dramatic in the Wagner case. Also because this was just happening in a very specific period of time. During the fin de siècle, it was just this enormous worldwide fad having to do with Wagner, and actually really impelling some very significant movements in the arts. Wagner played a role in the inception of symbolism, and he lurks behind many forms of early modernism. So he's playing an active role in the development of the arts. And then there's the political question as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating roster. I mean, it's from the Chicago School of Architecture, from Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham to English novelists like Virginia Woolf, and also Ford Madox Ford, and Joseph Conrad, and D.H. Lawrence, and of course Joyce. I mean, the way that the influence ramifies outward, and that made me think, or that makes me think of my great admiration for the subtitle of the book, which is Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, because I think there's a more conventional way of writing cultural history which would reverse that, which would talk about how music or a given art form reflects political developments or absorbs influences from the other arts. But music is really the central fact and the central force in this story. And I came away with the impression, as someone who's musically fairly ignorant, that if Wagner had been, merely a sort of a great cultural, a powerful cultural thinker, or polemicist, or even a theater artist of some genius, it's unlikely that we would still be talking about him almost 150 years later if there weren't something to the music, if there weren't something in that primary creation that just doesn't exhaust itself and keeps going and finds its way into all of these different circumstances and all of these different individual sensibilities and historical moments and cultural formations. What would you say? I mean, it's putting you a little on the spot, but what is it about that music? How would you describe or account for the power and the staying power of the music?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you liked the subtitle. At first it was Art in the Shadow of Music, and then we decided to put the politics in there because everyone loves politics. But obviously the political story is a very big part of this book, and it becomes bigger and bigger as it goes along. But the artistic experience is the central thing. But yeah, by saying sort of in the shadow of music, I wanted to have the sense that the sort of music is hanging over this book. But the heart of it is speaking about how the other art forms are being affected by music and being sort of shaped by the sound of this music. And also just sort of in terms of in the shadow of, this isn't just about direct influence and, Joyce listening to Die Walküre and, going and writing something. There's so many other forms that this takes. I'm talking about indirect, sort of more oblique influences. I'm talking about resemblances and sort of almost, coincidental kind of manifestations of similar ideas and similar themes. This is especially notable when you get to Victorian England and the pre-Raphaelites, weren't really influenced by Wagner at all. They came very independently to these Arthurian themes and Grail themes and Tristram and Isolde. But the fact that it sort of moves so closely in parallel with Wagner is sort of a topic that's just really interesting to sort of sink your teeth into. And so, yeah, this, by saying sort of in the shadow of, I'm just talking about sort of many different kinds of ways in which Wagner infiltrates the cultural conversation. I've now lost track of the second part of your question.
I mean, to pick up on that, actually, just because I should probably bring this around to some of my own interests. One of the great stories that you have to tell about how Wagner and his music and his ideas sort of project themselves, as it were, forward well beyond his own life and what he could have literally known or intended, is of course film, which you make a case for him as being, we think about the kind of the technological forerunners of cinema in photography, or even in painting and the other visual arts, but you make a very strong case that it is from the start a kind of a under the sign of Wagner in Germany, and also then subsequently in Hollywood.
Yeah. Yeah, well, now you were asking about what is it about the music itself, what kind of effect did it have on people? And I think that actually links up very precisely with your next question, because there's something in this music which is filmic and cinematic. It just didn't unfold the way previous musical works unfolded. This sense of continuity with Wagner, this sort of dissolving from one idea to another. And this was precisely the experience that was alienating to me when I first listened to music as a kid, because I had grown up with classical music, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert. Here's the first theme, clearly delineated. Here's the second theme. They developed, they recapitulated. And with Wagner, it's all this blur. It's all this flow, endless melody, as he liked to say. And this is a kind of cinematic experience. The way he used the orchestra, sort of creating these illusions of landscape and illusions of atmosphere in the orchestra, these shimmering effects, this luminous shimmering sound at the beginning of Lohengrin, the sheer gradualness of the emergence of the Rheingold prelude, these amazing transitions. And so people felt transported by this. They felt mesmerized by this. It was simply kind of a new way of experiencing art for a lot of people. And at Bayreuth, the lights go down. Very unusual kind of opera house where all the sight lines go straight to the stage. There's this dramatic double proscenium, which has the effect of creating a kind of screen in front of you on which the action is unfolding. The orchestra is hidden in this deep sunken pit, which means you don't see the musicians. The sound is just kind of emanating from the walls, almost as if it were a built-in speaker system. The Bayreuth has been described by a number of different commentators over the years as the proto-cinema, as sort of the first movie house. And so I think that is where sort of Wagner's eventual effect on film history was almost foreordained, because Wagner was offering a kind of proto-cinematic experience. So right from the start in the movies, you heard Wagner on soundtracks, or even before there were soundtracks, sort of from movie house pianists. Leitmotifs, Wagnerian leitmotifs, whether by him or by other people, were used to identify different characters and figures on the screen. And then you have this sort of gravitation toward big, heroic, mythic themes in the movies, which often end up echoing Wagnerian themes, and Fritz Lang's Nibelungen is the very obvious example of this. But at the end of the book, I go into fantasy culture and sci-fi of the 1970s onward, and there the sort of Wagnerian resemblances, whether they're direct influences or not, become quite unmistakable. The Lord of the Rings is a very Wagnerian story, and so that's I think it's worthy of scrutiny from all kinds of angles. I mean, so why is this happening in American culture? What is it about American culture, Hollywood culture, American pop culture that feels such attraction to these Wagnerian themes? And what does that say about us? Because we're always concerned about what does Wagner say about Germany and German history. But when you get to Wagner Hollywood, I think it mirrors perhaps a slightly more kind of ominous aspect of how American culture projects certain American myths. So I think that's a theme that I settle on quite strongly at the end, which I know is a theme that you've written often about in your work. What exactly do these superhero narratives mean about American society, and have occasionally stirred up controversy and opposition when you question that mythology, and it's very rich. I think it's just very important to contemplate.
Yeah, and I mean, and you do you frame this very sharply when you talk about what may be the most famous use of Wagner in late 20th century popular culture, which is the ride of Valkyries in Apocalypse Now. The strafing of this village, and you talk about the very troubling implications of that, and just how that the sense of scale and violence and the sort of the sublimity of the images and the sounds, which may have been intended, with some critical irony toward the American project in Vietnam, end up kind of representing a sort of a dimension of imperialism and aggression, and sort of a spectacle that is troubling to contemplate, to say the least.
Yeah. I mean, the Ride of the Valkyries becomes an anthem of American power, American supremacy, American white supremacy, you could say, because there's, of course, a racial undertone to that sequence in Apocalypse Now. And this is something that Hollywood does to Wagner. This militarizing of Ride of the Valkyries is something very distinct that happens when Hollywood gets its hands on Wagner, because it's not the case in the late 19th century. The Ride of the Valkyries had quite different implications for a lot of people. If you think about the fact that Loie Fuller danced her famous fire dance, one of the founding instances of modern dance, to the Ride of the Valkyries. It was often a symbol of female power. It was a music that was empowering to certain feminist writers and artists. But starting with The Birth of a Nation, when the Ride of the Valkyries accompanies the ride of the Ku Klux Klan, the music acquires a quite different connotation. It becomes male, it becomes military, and then you get this association with aerial warfare, which actually starts even in the First World War. Proust, of all people, is one of the first to make this association between the Ride of the Valkyries and aerial combat, and then sort of that grows and grows. And so it's a brilliant kind of act of cultural irony on the part of not so much John Milius, the screenwriter who came up with the idea, who was quite a conservative guy and really may not have intended much of a devastating critique, but certainly with Coppola and Walter Murch. And Walter Murch himself has acknowledged this, this strange afterlife began, where the Ride of the Valkyries became kind of, favorite music for military guys, sort of to pump themselves up when they're going into battle, and was actually blasted off of, out of loudspeakers on tanks in the Iraq War, and that's an instance of the critique being swallowed up in just that such a powerful combination of the music and that thrilling military imagery, and this is a critique that you could say happened, you could apply to Wagner himself. You could say that the Ring Cycle is a critique of power. It is an attempt at supplanting the lust for power with the force of love, and yet the music itself is so viscerally thrilling, and the entry of the gods into Valhalla is so magnificent and majestic that you can easily forget that this is supposed to be an ironic spectacle. The gods are doomed, they're deluded, and they're going to go down in flames. But when you have a huge orchestra making all that sound, irony very easily disappears. And so I think that's a syndrome that starts with Wagner himself.
Let's turn to some questions. All of you out there who we unfortunately cannot see, if you go to the Q&A, the little bubble down at on the bottom rail, you can type in your questions. And I want to start with an anonymous question, which may be a sort of a stump the band question for you. Is it fair, Alex, to compare Wagner to Kanye West in terms of his ambition, his international celebrity, his influence on all of the arts, his ability to force everyone to have an opinion about him?
I hadn't actually thought of that, but that is an interesting comparison. I'm slightly afraid to sort of wade into it, but this is an artist who has exercised his influence on so many different forms, and not just music, and is now dabbling somewhat in politics in a somewhat unfortunate way. And without getting into the specifics of that too much, because I'm far from being an expert on Kanye West, and I know there are sort of very careful distinctions that have to be made in terms of talking about, his personality and his sort of strange political performances. But what I would say sort of more widely is that this question of how American pop culture participates in American power and American hegemony, I think is a somewhat under-examined question. And one idea that I'm sort of advancing toward the end of Wagnerism is to encourage people to sort of use the case of Wagner to think about our own experience, our own American cultural experience, and to contemplate that same question. And again, sort of not, instead of looking at the problem of art intersecting with politics and power, in the case of Wagner, as something from the past, which we look upon with horror and dismay. These are stories that are still playing themselves out. And this is a syndrome that's still very much in play. And so, what are the cultural roots of Donald Trump? He has little or no interest in classical music. He actually hates Wagner. I learned that from reading my old boss, Tina Brown's diaries. She imparted that useful piece of information. Never again, he said, after going to see the Ring Cycle at the Met. And his roots are pop culture. He comes from reality TV. He comes from sort of just sort of celebrity real estate culture, whatever that is. He comes from, the World Wrestling Federation. He blasts Rolling Stones and Neil Young at his rallies. They may not like it. Those artists may be asking him to stop, but those songs are working. They're having an intended effect. They're blending with his act. And this is the older syndrome going back to Born in the USA and Reagan and so on and so forth. So it's just I feel there's a question that we could confront more often, and maybe Kanye West is one place to do it, but I would shy away from taking that on myself.
Another person had another thought, in a way, another comparative thought, a little bit closer maybe to at least to Wagner's own time, which I found, and as someone with fairly rudimentary knowledge of these questions. The question is it fair to say that Wagner is the opposite of Verdi?
I would call him the opposite of Verdi. I think Verdi and Wagner were surprisingly similar figures in terms of the role that they played in their national cultures. And Verdi became a powerful symbol of the reunification of Italy, really just at the same time that Wagner was playing that role in Germany. And I think perhaps more unambiguously, more effectively, because Wagner actually remained a divisive figure in Germany after the unification. And there were some nationalists and there were some reactionaries, some anti-Semites who did not like Wagner, found him to be suspect and bohemian. They thought actually that he was too close to Jews because there were a great many Jews around him in his circle, and there was this rumor that he was himself of Jewish ancestry. But in any case, Verdi played that role as sort of national symbol, as the patriarch of a powerful new national culture. We think of just Verdi has a better reputation in the wider culture, deservedly so. He lacked a number of Wagner's nastier characteristics, not just in terms of the anti-Semitism, but just as a personality. I mean, just Wagner was completely impossible in so many ways. But there is Verdi becomes, once Verdi is enmeshed with Italian politics and Italian nationalism, he begins playing a role, which of course can lead to sort of take a darker form in the fascist period. And it's interesting, with Toscanini, who loved Verdi and Wagner equally. And those were his two gods. He was desperate actually in the fascist period, the Nazi period, to pull those figures away from Italian fascism and Nazism respectively, and to keep hold of their cosmopolitan, their universal allure. So during the war, he actually put on a Wagner and Verdi concert in New York. It was a benefit for the Red Cross. And he was saying, these figures belong to us. They don't simply belong to the fascist nations. So yeah, I wouldn't see them as opposites at all, despite their obvious differences.
A few people have asked this question, or a version of it, which is, in the process of writing the book, have you changed your opinion of Wagner or any aspect of Wagner? And if so, how?
I don't know. People have asked me that. They've asked whether I've gotten sick of Wagner. I haven't, I have to say. It's disappointing. But so often when I was working on this book, I was constantly listening to Wagner, or sort of looking at aspects of the score in terms of how it related to what I was writing. Wagner was always present, but most of the time I was actually doing literary criticism or film criticism, attempting architecture and dance criticism, and so all of the energy went into trying to come up to speed on some of these art forms that I'm, have in some cases written almost nothing about over the years. And so sort of Wagner was just sort of always there in the background. But no, this whole project has made Wagner all the more interesting to me, just having discovered so many aspects of how so many different people heard him in different ways, or how people from very different backgrounds seem to hear him in the same way. Sort of led me back to the music in a way that was almost refreshing. And yeah, I just in the past few weeks, I've been working on my website, putting together sound examples to go along with the book chapter by chapter, therestisnoise.com. You can find this stuff there. And I have a list of recommended recordings. So I went through them all again, and not all of them. there's more than 300 recordings available of Tristan und Isolde alone. So no one has listened to them all. But he's always changing. He always means something slightly different each time I come back to him. And I think, I don't want to ever sound as though he's some sort of superhuman, godlike presence who's doing these extraordinary things to us. Why this happens, why he has such a strong effect is not just him. And he wrote the librettos, he wrote the music, he was just extraordinarily involved in every aspect of the process. But ultimately, how the music is transmitted to us is through the singers. It's through the orchestras, it's now through stage directors, and stage directors are coming up with these radical new visions of Wagner, which I think have done a great deal to complicate and enrich his image in recent decades. And so the Wagner that we're dealing with is not just this one man and his admittedly remarkable abilities. It is this great crowd of people who are involved in Wagner and are bringing Wagner to us. And I would count all the writers and scholars in that as well. Some of these wonderful books are behind me on my shelves. So Wagner is this immense, unruly crowd of people, and not just one strange, kind of violent little man.
Well, that actually leads me to what I think will be the last question, and I'm going to take the liberty of revising the audience question, because the audience question was, which you can certainly answer, is if you have a single favorite work of Wagner. But given what you've just said, which comes through very much in some of the later chapters of the book about the kind of the interpretation and rediscovery, and in a way reinvention, especially after the Second World War, of Wagner, are there particular productions or interpretations of Wagner that stand out to you as particularly important or vital or interesting?
Yeah, pretty much at the top of my list would be, there are two recordings, or one audio recording, one video recording, which seem pretty essential to me. Both of the same work, The Ring of the Nibelung. One is a recording from the 1955 Bayreuth Festival with an absolutely extraordinary cast of singers. There are all these recordings from the 1950s, and it was just an absolute high watermark of Wagner's singing. And also at Bayreuth, there was this enormous new energy being released by Wieland Wagner, going in a quite radical new direction in terms of how he was staging Wagner. So a lot of old conventions were being set aside. And so there was just this enormous freshness in terms of how just the music was being sung and played back then. But this one recording conducted by Josef Keilbert, with Astrid Varnay as Brunhilde, who's sort of more or less my favorite Wagnerian dramatic soprano, just a singer of enormous technical power, but also just piercing intelligence. Her Brunhilde is just so complex, and she is the ultimate hero of the cycle. Wotan is Hans Hotter, and there's lots of other wonderful singers in the cast. That's, people debate, the Wagnerians, the Wagner Society of New York is probably arguing as we speak, no, the 1953 Krauss ring is better than so on. But that's, I mean, it's a magnificent recording, and I recommend it highly. And then there's the video of Patrice Chéreau's Bayreuth production it ran from 1976 to 1980. This was a great reinvention. Wagner had already been reinvented in the 50s, but Chéreau was the one who showed the ring cycle as this great allegory of really 19th century culture, an allegory of the rise and fall of the 19th century bourgeoisie. And it is a cycle actually in which sort of Wagnerism, the kind of panorama of Wagnerism and all these different influences and ramifications is visible. George Bernard Shaw's Wagner, the French Wagner, the sort of Wilhelmine, pompous Wagner, Thomas Mann Wagner. It's sort of all there, and it's a magnificent production, and certainly one of the greatest Wagner productions that have been recorded. So those are good starting points. And the Ring, it would be impossible for me to name a favorite Wagner work. I mean, I sort of go round and round in terms of the Ring, Tristan, and Parsifal are the three that fascinate me the most. But it's finding these moments that are done in some startling new way, in any production, in any recording, that just sort of bring the whole thing back to life again. Just some phrase is kind of couched in a way that just reveals something new, and that's the power of performance. And this is what Wagner would have wanted, I think. Who knows what Wagner would have wanted? But he was such a believer in performance. He was a theater artist. He was a man of the theater, and that's all that ultimately mattered to him. And the tragedy is that his involvement in so many other areas was it distracted him from that goal, and it just distracted all of us from those goals, and had some very dire effects in terms of his political influence. But when you just come back to the theater, it's so complex. There's just no getting around the fact that these are incredibly complex and ambiguous works that defeat any single explain everything kind of interpretation, whether political or otherwise. It'll always be undermined by some element from within the work itself.
Well, I mean, I think that your book demonstrates this and makes this argument in so many different ways, and is really, in addition to being a utterly captivating and enlightening experience in its own right, brings you back, as the best criticism always must, to the work itself, to other interpretations of the work, and also I think, speaking for myself, I mean, just was sort of gave me a new set of spectacles through which to look at all of the spectacles that are around us. So everyone out there, this is the book. You should buy it. It's $40 is a lot cheaper than an opera ticket, and you can't go to the opera anyway. So it's beautiful. It has color plates, and it's just I promise you. I mean, it was the highlight of my summer, was the many hours I spent reading this book, and then queuing up the playlist on my phone, and then hunting down some of the references. So
there's a lovely picture of Keanu Reeves, so it's all in there.
The Matrix is in there. Terrence Malick. My Wagnerian education before reading this book was pretty much Bugs Bunny, but he's in there too. So
Mhm.
thank you, Alex. Thanks for this book and this wonderful conversation about it. It's been
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tony. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Again, it's an incredible, best book I've read all year so far. It's incredible to hear more about it. And thank you so much to Scott Carlton, of course, Alex Ross, A.O. Scott, everyone who asked questions. If you missed any of the event for any reason, we'll have it on YouTube. And please buy the book. It's excellent.
all right. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Take care, Alex. Good luck with the rest of the tour.